All right, the action isn't all centered on the Federal Reserve today. The Senate is putting up a big spending vote today. Both sides aren't tackling this enough, according to my next guest, the former Reagan budget director, David Stockman. This is a debt ceiling measure that sort of, I guess, punts on this for another couple of years, David, and then they'll regroup. But by then, we'll have another $2 trillion in red ink. Obviously, you're not a fan.
Yeah, I mean, today is a peak moment of lunacy, both at the Fed and on Capitol Hill with this budget bill. We're at month 121 of the longest business expansion in history. By every economic textbook ever written, you're supposed to be reducing the deficit, actually running a surplus. We actually had one under Bill Clinton, of all things, in the year 2000 at the end of the 1990s boom. Today, we're going to have $1 trillion going up this year, 5% of GDP, and we're heading for a recession. Nobody outlawed the business cycle. We're going to have a recession. The deficit will hit $2 trillion in the early 2020s per year. We're going to end up not with a $22 trillion deficit that everybody kind of ignores, but a $42 trillion deficit by the end of the next 10-year cycle. Now, the Fed is making this possible. It is basically euthanized Washington. They think they could get away with this kind of debt building year after year in these massive amounts because it doesn't cost much, because the Fed is keeping interest rates so, sub-economically, artificially low that it's put the politicians to sleep. And it's done the same thing in the C-suites of corporate America. They're borrowing hand over fist, but not to create jobs or new capacity or new efficiencies, but to buy back their stock and do, ridiculous M&A deals. So we're burying the country in debt, 72 trillion, public and private. That's what the Fed has done. It's enabling the politicians to, go on this kind of debt-fueled lark. And it's not helping the Main Street economy. We're in a pretty bad state of affairs, I would say.
All right, I'll put you as a maybe on the state of Washington right now. But let me get one of the issues that was raised, and maybe it happened in the last meltdown. Ben Bernanke comes on board. He's all of a sudden looking at a depression. He's a student of the Depression. He studied it exhaustively, that the Federal Reserve did all these unusual, unprecedented things like buying up Treasury notes and bonds and the quantitative easing. This president has said that changed everything, and he wants the same thing that Barack Obama had, the same sort of accommodated Federal Reserve that will be keeping rates low and forcing them down to zero, and then we'd be off to the races. What do you think of that?
Well, Trump is out to lunch. He's an economic ignoramus on monetary policy. He's a bully. He's one of the forces, hacking on the Fed right now. But he ignores history. We had 10 years after Bernanke's, great experiment, which I think was unnecessary, another issue, in which the federal funds rate was lower than the inflation rate. 10 years running, 126 months in a row. Nothing like it in history. Negative real interest rates. That didn't help Main Street. It didn't help households get a mortgage or small businesses to fund their working capital. It basically was free carry trade money for the speculators and gamblers on Wall Street. That's all it did. Now, finally, the Fed said after 10 years, maybe we can get the real interest rate a tiny bit positive. So today, the funds rate is 2.4. The year-over-year core CPI in June was 2.15. So we got a tiny 25 basis point real interest rate. I mean, that's crazy compared to history. It was 4% back in 2000 before they eased, and 2.5% in 2007
well,
before they eased.
Well, that was my big worry, because we don't have a lot of proverbial arrows in the quiver. But the one thing that bothers me, just stepping way back on all of this, is this notion that I've always seen the Federal Reserve, it's not a pristine or saintly institution, but I've always likened it to the adult at an otherwise squabbling politician's table. They intervene to address the ravages of excess on the part of our fiscal policy and Republicans and Democrats running amok, doing whatever they want. And they were the ones who would rein it back in or would try to temper it. Now they're adding to it. And I worry that even though, Jerome Powell is going to explain that this is not in response to the president jawboning him to cut rates, it's going to look that way to a lot of people. And it's going to feed the argument that the adult has left the room.
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head. That may have been true 30, 40 years ago. But today, the Fed is the enablers.
Right.
They are the enablers. You have a Fed dominated by a posse of liberal Keynesian statists who think 12 people have been authorized to run the entire financial system, not only of the United States, but of the entire world.
Right, and Paul Volcker and company, this is not that. And the Stern and medicine to address what he said needed to be addressed then, we don't have that now.
No, we don't, and we have Republicans and conservatives with their heads buried so deep in the sand that it's pathetic. The threat to capitalism, the threat to prosperity, the threat to free enterprise economics, if you want to call it that, is the Federal Reserve. It's the 12 people sitting there as a monetary politburo, arrogating unto themselves the right to run the economy and pretending after free money for 10 years that they're going to take out an insurance cut because they think they can make the economy better. They're not going to make the economy better. We've had this massive expansion of the Fed's balance sheet, as you mentioned, $900 billion at the time of the crisis, peak $4.5 trillion. What did it do for growth? 1.6% real growth for the last 11 years, half the rate that we had in all the previous cycles, including under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. So it doesn't help Main Street. The households are now, at peak debt. They got $15.6 trillion of debt. Businesses didn't use the last 10 years to delever. They took their debt from $10 trillion to $15.5 trillion. We've just buried the economy in debt. That's what these fools have done. And have we heard one Republican politician have enough sense to call a spade, to sound the alarm? This is the real threat. It's not the four people in the squad or even the socialists who were debating last night, who could spend more money if they get elected president on the Democratic ticket. That's bad enough. But let me tell you, long before we get there, you have the Fed that is really taking this economy down. It is a threat fundamentally to the Main Street economy. It's killing savers. It's killing wage workers. It's a terrible thing, and they're doing it because at the end of the day, they're deathly afraid of a hissy fit on Wall Street. They've created a speculative monster, and now they're afraid to face it down. That's
just
the heart
about
of the matter.
Paul Volcker, he knew when he was raising rates 1 full point at a time. He said, the markets will go crazy. He said, I don't give a damn about the markets. I'm not going to count out to them. That's a very different mentality than what we see today. David Stockman. Always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you very much. What I love about you, Dave, is you tick everybody off. Democrats, Republicans, nuns. So thank you very, very much.
Okay.
All right.